thrilled to be here today. Some absolutely fantastic teams in the round that we respect a lot. We're very excited to come to you today to speak about the motion for the House, that this House would force religious adoption agencies to place children with homosexual couples. So the model we'd like to put forward today is that in liberal democracies, religious adoption agencies will be forbidden by the state to disqualify homosexual couples purely on the basis of their sexuality, on penalty of losing their accreditation or license with the state. And I'm going to talk today about three things. First, going to consider the obligation of the state in comparison with the rights of religious groups, a consideration of a model of religious freedom. I'm then going to talk about how it's important to make the next generation more tolerant than we see today, and close finally with a consideration of what's best for children. Haley then will come up in her speech and talk about why it's necessary for the state to make this their official stance, and how that's necessary for perceptual shift. So the first thing I want to talk about today is how this is the obligation of the state, and how in comparing that obligation with the rights of religious groups, it's clear that the state needs to forbid religious adoption agencies from being so bigoted. So what is our model of freedom of religion here? Haley and I are full advocates of the secular state. We surely believe that there's a place for religion, an important place, but we don't think that it should have sort of pernicious social harms. So the model we're creating then, or we're suggesting for freedom of religion, is we allow freedom of religion so long as there is not an identifiable social harm that we can see from a certain policy that's justified in the name of freedom of religion. We have so this, for example, is the justification in the United States for banning animal slaughter by religious groups that would otherwise do it. There's a public health concern from engaging in animal slaughter that justifies the states restricting religious freedom in this, for this reason. We'd also like to distinguish it, though, from freedom of speech, because we believe there's a big difference from simply engaging in your protected right to speech and taking a specific action which has social harms. So those are the two sort of beginning caveats. So what are the harms we identify here? The first of these is that you're restricting the right to raise a child, which Haley and I would say is a fundamental part of the human experience. No, thank you. We think this is an essential part of the longevity and continuity of the species, and it's an important part of growing older and becoming an adult. Also, we think there's only, in general, reason to limit preferences if, again, there's a risk to others. So what Haley and I stand in firm affirmation of is there is no risk to the child here from being a child of a homosexual couple. We think it's bigoted and completely unjustifiable by the statistics and research that homosexual couples are, categorically worse parents than heterosexual couples. So that's the first thing we think you're doing here, is restricting that fundamental right to raise a child. It's necessary for the human experience, and also there's no reason to limit preferences in this case because there's no risk. Sure.
Given that in the liberal democracies that you've confined your motion to be about, there are already secular charities that engage in adoption for which homosexual couples would qualify, isn't their right to raise a child already capable of being actionable?
Sure. So this is just a matter of consistency. We would say the inconsistency with the state allowing religious bigotry and denying of rights by an individual group. Like, we don't allow an individual to violate someone else's right just because the state doesn't. We don't think that's an acceptable policy. Similarly, just because one group happens to not be violating these people's rights doesn't mean when someone else does it, it's suddenly okay. No, thank you. So secondly, what's the second harm we can identify? And this is the sort of larger social harms that we see in today's society. The prevalence of hate crimes against homosexual people, the culture of intolerance that has been bred by a lack of exposure, and the belief that these people are not the same is something we actively want to combat. We think this is a identifiable and significant social harm that the culture of intolerance and these hate crimes that demands the government take an action. So those are the two harms we've identified. So I'll close this point, which was with exactly what the POI from closing opposition brought up. Why does this mean the state needs to act here? And as a matter of consistency, as I told you in the response to his point, it's not okay for an individual agency to deny rights when we identify that it is a fundamental right and there's no justification for the limiting of that right, just because another party happens to not be violating that right. So that's not something we stand for on our side of the house. We don't think it's an acceptable policy. The second general point we want to talk about is how it's so important to make the next generation more tolerant. As I just told you, Haley and I can identify, and I think it's very apparent in a lot of Western liberal democracies, despite being progressive on many fronts, there is still this culture of intolerance against homosexual couples. We haven't seen the same progress here that we have in terms of race. And we think that in many ways, the move towards homosexual equality now is very similar to the move for racial equality 50 years ago. In this way, we think it's the same sorts of steps that were taken 50 years ago in the States, for instance, for promoting the perception of racial equality are necessary here. How did that happen, Mr. Speaker? Things like the forced integration of schools. Even if, even if, take the case for Brown v. Board, which was justified on the idea that education could never be equal between two different school districts, even if they had been able to prove that, Haley and I would say that's still not okay, because we don't want to promote that culture of intolerance and ghettoization and separation among different people. So the same way that this problem was identified, a problem of racism in the society, you combat it in the youth, in the younger generation by forcing them to integrate, forcing them to, meet each other and have exposure to each other. That is the same way Haley and I would like to combat, the same way Haley and I would like to combat this social problem of bias and prejudice against homosexual couples by forcing the next generation to be more tolerant. This policy clearly accomplishes that goal because you create a new generation that has been raised by homosexual couples. Haley and I would say as successfully, or we have every reason to believe as successfully as by heterosexual couples. These are clearly the best advocates we have then because they're being grown in a situation when they can use their personal experience as a justification for fighting this culture and the intolerance of others. So the final thing we'd like to talk about is a consideration of what's best for children. And I've sort of touched on this a couple times, but the big thing we want you all to realize is Haley and I, and we think all of us, have no reason to believe that homosexual couples would be less capable of raising children than heterosexual couples. The gentleman on closing opposition at the Oxford tournament told you in a roundabout licensing parroting that the most important thing was love. And we would say that's the same thing here. All you need is love, and we don't think there is a big difference in the amount of love that can be offered by a homosexual couple and a heterosexual couple. We'd say also there's a matter of physical resources. Can you physically raise a child? That can be considered through the other processes. It doesn't need to be taken into consideration, and it's clearly not a proxy for homosexual or heterosexuality. So the final thing I want to talk about is why this is necessary, considering social services are so overstretched. There simply aren't enough homes for children that need to be adopted. So the real comparison, the real choice we want to present you in this round is not a consideration of the rights of these adoption agencies, but we believe a consideration of the rights of the child. A state can step in when a child is receiving bad care from parents. I think this is exactly the same, because we think that always foster homes, foster care is comparatively worse than a stable, loving family. For that reason, we firmly stand in opposition of today's motion.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and call upon the leader of the opposition to open up the case for that side of the House.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what we think we got from first proposition was kind of lots of generalized reasons why it'd be nice if gay people possibly had kids to look after, but nothing that really engaged specifically with the religious component in this debate. And that's what we need to bring into, because we think it's pretty important. So my speech is going to talk about the nature of religious exceptions and why this is a particularly important religious exception to have. And secondly, I am going to say that it is difficult for children and families to be put into this sort of context, especially when they come from the sort of religious background that we suspect they will have come from. Okay, before that, a little bit of rebuttal, because what did we really hear? Firstly, we heard, gay people have a right to have a child. Yeah, of course, we're not going to say they don't, that's a bit of an odd op. But we will say that they already have that right, and that right is protected by the fact that they have other alternative institutions from which they can get a child. They essentially conceded that. They said, yeah, but consistency dictates we have to do this. Consistency is not a principle in the abstract, that we have to make all things consistent generally. It has, if there are significant differences between these religious institutions and specific reasons why you want to make it inconsistent, we think that's fair, I'm going to give you those. Then they say, it's really important to force people to integrate. This is exactly like the civil rights movement. Fine, again, we're not stopping all gay people from having children. We think it's in fact good to encourage that. We should encourage more social workers to do that. We should disseminate more information to try and encourage that sort of thing. But we don't think you should necessarily coerce a religious institution to do that. And again, no analysis on why specifically kids from a religious institution need to be the ones that are forced to integrate. And then finally, they said, there's no difference in love. Yeah, okay, again, we're not going to say gay people are bad lovers. They don't love their children. That's fine. We do think there are significant differences. both from the institutional perspective and for the child, and I'm going to go into that. So first, this idea of why we think a religious exception is important in this case. Because first of all, we do accept that religion is something distinct and unique. It's a right that we protect, even though it's a chosen thing. It's something we protect very strongly in the state, and thank you. Why do we do that? We say it's because it's core to the individual religious person's identity and their purpose on earth. They essentially, the difference is that a religious person essentially says, my life and to lead a good life is not to lead a life where I sort of have a happiness and do good things, but it's literally to live a religiously good life. The only real value to my life is the extent to which it accords with religion, is the extent to which I'm endorsed through religion, and the extent to which I can go to heaven. We think that's thank you. We think that makes the whole purpose of an individual's life religion to that extent, especially churches and priests who are making decisions. No, thank you. We think it's specifically true for them. We say under those sorts of situations, we think it's incredibly damaging to essentially coerce these people, priests, religious institutions, etc., to make what becomes a horrendously unconscionable choice between A, closing down, which we think a lot of them will do by just saying, look, we think it's pretty horrendous, we can't do this, no, thank you, we will just close down. We think that's particularly bad because in places like the UK, the majority of adoption centres are from a religious background, and they also have by far the best success rate, no thank you, because they're very good at local outreach, and they're very good at making it seem like those are the sorts of kids you'd want to have, because they're from the same religion as you. So we think closing down is a real problem, no thank you. We think even if they don't close down, we think what you force them to try and do is to make a choice between, closing down and allowing those children, to have, I'll take you in a second, not a very good quality of life, which is a nasty thing to make someone do. Or to essentially feel like you're destroying that child by putting them into an environment where they're raised by people who you think are fundamentally sinful. People who basically are doing something that offends God and offends, the nature of man. We think nasty bullying, horrible, but we think that is a core belief in the way these people have been brought up for generations. It's core to their doctrine, and it's core to who they are. They've internalized this part of their identity. So to make them do that, to make them feel like they are destroying a child, is an incredibly nasty thing to do. We think under those conditions, there is an immense burden of interference. It's not just like they said, where, if there is some social harm, we think we should do this. Absolutely not. It has to be an unbelievably assignable and unbelievably serious social harm, but they haven't given you that. They've just given you a very generalized sort of social harm. We don't think that's enough when there do exist alternatives, when these rights are enforceable through other means. And indeed, what we tell you is, let's let the state be incredibly active in trying to get gay people to have more kids. Let's release far more information about how easy it is. Let's release information, one of the biggest problems with trying to shift kids is just a lack of social workers, like an unbelievable lack of social workers, individuals who go out and outreach to the community. That's why religious institutions are so good. Let's as a state match those institutions and do that. But let's not just force them out of these religious institutions into the families of gay people. That's ridiculous. Go.
You just acknowledged that the majority of these agencies are religious. Do you think it's really fair then to suggest that there's a choice for parents who adopt out their children?
Well, that's
they are actually religious.
Well, that's exactly right. We think we should try. The reason is they're just very good, right? But we should try and encourage better state institutions to match those religious institutions. We think that'll give even more choice to gay people who currently have a choice under status quo. Okay, on to this idea about why this might be difficult for the children and families, right? Because we think often these children have grown up in an institutionalized context, which is actually pretty horrendously nasty, living in the context of foster home. We think one of the things that happens in that context is, generally speaking, a dislike of gay people, is a sort of, gay being used as a slur, is a sort of perception that gay people, no thank you, are like the worst kinds of people. We think when you grow up in that sort of context, going into a family of gay parents is a problem, and we think it's exacerbated, because if you get bullied at school, you end up starting to blame your parents on that. We think it's a very general problem as to why gay people often have difficulty raising children. We think it's particularly difficult, though, when it grows up in a religious institution, no thank you. Within a religious institution, you are essentially taught that not only is it just something that society doesn't like, or that your friends make fun of you about, but it actually is something which is core to your doctrine and identity. And we think that's really dangerous, because these are the individuals, the exact individuals, who are likely to be particularly discriminatory, no thank you, against gay people when they go into that family. We think that creates a very difficult dynamic between those parents and those children. We think it's, generally speaking, always a difficult dynamic, but it's particularly difficult. We also think, finally, that there's a real problem at the level of the child, because often, when someone has got such a difficult life, and when they've been in an institutionalized context like this, often they do cling on, and they have come from religious upbringing, they often cling on to religion as the one thing that gets them through life, as something which they can at least hold on to when everything else is absolutely awful. But this forces them into a sort of identity crisis, because it says, now everything you've been taught is actually completely wrong. In fact, your parents are, they're perfectly nice gay people. So either your parents are bad, or you've been wrong all of your life, and this thing that you've clung on to is somehow bad. And we think that's actually very difficult. We don't know how that cognitive dissonance will necessarily resolve itself. We don't think it'll necessarily always resolve itself in good ways, especially when kids are so young. Like, we think when they grow up, absolutely fine. Try and educate them, inform them, in schools, for instance, try and help them to develop more and less homophobic attitudes. We think that's absolutely fine. But don't do it through the family, through the specific parent-child relationship. We think that's a very sensitive, very delicate relationship, and we think if you make someone doubt their identity and doubt their own religion within the context of the family, we think that's incredibly dangerous. So because, ladies and gentlemen, we think there are grounds for specialized religious exemptions in this case, and because it's especially pernicious at the level of the family itself and for the child himself, we urge you to oppose this motion.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and invite forward the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So what side government has told you today in this round is we've asked you under very nuanced rights analysis when the government can step in favor of basically into the realm of religion. And we've told you that the reason that the government can step in is because it has social implications. It has an impact on society. These adoptions agencies are not parents who have discretion over how to raise their child. They're serving a social function of placing the child in what is hopefully a loving and supportive environment. And we do not think that it's acceptable, even on the basis of religious beliefs, to deny children that opportunity, particularly given that child services resources are so stretched. So what I'm going to do in this speech is rebuild a lot of what you've heard from Jeff's, which we don't get a lot of response from side opposition, and then I'm going to address their case, which is basically this is going to be harmful to the child. What Jeff and I are telling you is it's harmful to the child to keep them in the environment of the adoptive agency when there are perfectly good, loving parents that are willing to adopt them, simply on the basis of what we all agree in this round is a bigoted outlook. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about, Jeff's first point was about the freedom of religion and how this is acceptable for the government to interfere. All they've responded to you by saying is that the right to own a child, or the right to raise a child is being fulfilled in this case because there are secular adoptive agencies who are willing to give children to homosexual families. But Jeff and I had told you that given that we think that this is a right, we do not think that it is sufficient. If we agree that everybody has a right to be employed, just because some employers are willing to hire minorities, it is not acceptable for other employers to discriminate. I think this is very clear. This is very consistent with most rights analysis that people would agree with. So just because people aren't discriminating in some circumstances does not mean the right is not being violated when there is in fact discrimination. And that's why we think the government has a right to step in and interfere. We also have identified to you a clear social impact of this religious belief, which comes out more strongly in the third point, which is about the impact on children. So I'd like to move down to that. Because all they've done to respond to that is, yeah, well, homosexual homes are still different, and basically responding based on what they said in their case. But we have told you that being in an adoptive environment is not a good environment for these children, and that the state does have a right to step in, even when parents are not providing a good environment for their children, and to require them to provide a good environment. And what we're saying is that when there is a loving and supportive home that these children can go to, that it's not right for the adoptive agencies to deny them that opportunity on the basis of what is a bigoted belief. And that's why we think that the government has a right to step in. So now I'm going to move on to their case to talk to you a little bit about why we think that this isn't different, and why this isn't this is not an exception to the not an acceptable religious exception. So the first thing that they tell you is that religion is a protected right, but we do not think that the adoptive agencies, specifically by virtue of their religion, have the specific purview over the child that they should be able to deny them that opportunity. They also talk to you about how Okay. They also tell you how these religious organizations should not be forced to put children in a circumstance where they think that they're being exposed to sin and where they think that they are destroying the child. But that is not a belief that we support. If we accept, as side opposition does, that it is not an acceptable belief and it's not something that we agree with, it's not reasonable, just because we think it would be painful for these people to place the children in that situation, we don't think it's reasonable for them not to carry out the responsibility that the state does in fact expect them to carry out. So if, for example, a doctor believed that a homosexual was living in a life of sin and he was working in an emergency room, just because it would be painful for him to preserve that individual in a life of sin, we don't think that that gives him the right to then deny him medical care. Similarly, we don't think that adoptive agencies, simply because of their religious beliefs, have the right to deny the children a loving home. Yes?
Given that, for example, in my country, a Catholic church does not have to employ a gay priest, a mosque does not have to employ a gay imam. In the name of consistency, if we're going to take it to the extent that you are, should they be forced to? Yes or no?
The operation of churches is often incredibly separate from the state, so we think that would be an exception. I don't think, given that we accept, we don't think that the right that we're saying here is that they have a right to raise a child, and that's something that we've all agreed with. So just because it's being partially fulfilled, you don't have a right to a specific type of employment. You have a right to an employment, and that's why we don't allow employers to discriminate on the basis of these protected characteristics. Similarly, we don't think that adoption agencies should be able to discriminate on the basis of these protected characteristics. The second thing that they tell you in their case is why this is harmful to the children. But what we're going to tell you is that we think that it's always a tough adjustment when these children are adopted. They're often going to be placed in homes where they feel uncomfortable and where they have trouble adjusting to the way that those homes are. But we do think that there's a larger social question at issue, and one that we think is more important for these adoption agencies to consider, or rather more important for the government to consider in terms of the gay right movement. Just because the children who went into the school in Little Rock had a difficult situation because they were bullied by the other kids, we didn't think that integration was any less important. Similarly, we think it's important that we bridge the social gap and that we send a message that all types of couples, whether homosexual or heterosexual, are equal. And furthermore, we don't think that given that these children, if in fact they are being raised in that environment, if they're being raised in a bigoted environment, we don't think that it's right to perpetuate them in that environment. That we want to move them into an environment where they will gradually learn that homosexual couples can be just as loving and just as caring as heterosexual couples, so they can then perpetuate that belief in future generations. So that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk to you about in our substantive point, which is about how this state stance is going to lead to a perceptual shift. We think that, first of all, the state is going to be sending a message, particularly to children who are being raised in these homes with homosexual parents, and to society at large, that's going to create the next generation that perceives these couples as being on an equal footing. We furthermore think that it's good that this particular model is going to decentralize the effort and force everyone to cooperate in that effort and everyone to be exposed to those beliefs, because we do think that this is an important movement. We do think that it's important that these individuals in society get the respect that they deserve, and therefore we are very proud of this.
I don't know who those crazy guys are at the back. I certainly wouldn't let them adopt. Maybe Will Jones though. Not. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do two things in my speech. I'm going to first of all look at why we think this is going to set back the homosexual movement and why that's damaging. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to show you why the homosexual movement isn't a monolithic bloc that has this debate inside internally about whether or not it's a good idea, precisely because they're worried about the backlash. Second, we're going to look at why this deprives bad parents who are Catholics of the option of adopting, and often you get child rearing by people who shouldn't really be rearing children, but are afraid that their child might be placed in the hands of a homosexual couple, and why that's harmful. Ladies and gentlemen, we say this debate is about social harms, but what makes this debate different from the racist argument and the Little Rock situation is we say damage to the movement as a whole, the closing down of agencies, the resentment and the bad parent, ladies and gentlemen, are huge social harms which we balance, even though we say they have a minimum standard to have children. So ladies and gentlemen, let's look at briefly what we had from these guys. I just realised I didn't stop them. Sorry. We say no, thank you. The first argument they gave us to you today, ladies, was these people have a right to adopt children. We say, yeah, well, that's why we think we give them a minimum standard of these rights, ladies and gentlemen. You can adopt for secular agencies. Even though you might argue that there are not a lot of them, we say that's an argument for putting more money and more investment in these government agencies. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, all the time we exempt religious agencies from certain legislation, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know why they gave you the example of employment, because, for example, in many countries, you're allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex, but not allowing female priests, ladies and gentlemen, to run parishes. We say, why? Because we realise and we recognise that religion is fundamental to your identity. It's part of your core. Your array of choices are modified by the type of culture you come under. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, just like we allow Sikhs to have exemptions for wearing helmets, we realise that there's no abstract value in having consistency for consistency's sake, but when there's a balance of harm situation, ladies and gentlemen, we do make that decision. That's why that consistency argument doesn't have any weight. Then let's look at the rights of the child, ladies and gentlemen, because they didn't engage with the analysis and mid on the table about why agencies are going to close. They dropped that completely. Because we say, well, you put people in this particular situation where they have to either close down or live with the prospect of condemning a child to hell. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, bear in mind that lots of countries in the world, like the UK, have a particularly good record, not only at placing children, but making sure children are raised in the correct way, ladies and gentlemen. Shut down, you provide a huge social service to the state. And that's damaging for those children, if you want to talk about the rights of the children. No, thank you. We came with the analysis about why, if you've been grown up in an institution which teaches against homosexuality, which says homosexuality is sin, suddenly be taken from that institution and be placed, ladies and gentlemen, in a particular gay couple household is damaging for your rights to an open future. Bear in mind you've institutionally been discriminated against anyway, you often have a disability, we're often an orphan. We say to doubly, ladies and gentlemen, damage people is unacceptable. Again, those guys didn't, I'll take them 1 second, didn't engage. Then last of all, this issue about, well, if you're anti-gay and you don't like maybe your doctor, we don't allow you to not treat them. Well, we say, if you're a doctor, the choice is easy, just don't treat the person, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we say it's the nature of the choice you put in front of these people. Condemn a child or shut down. Well, we say that choice is damaging, ladies and gentlemen, and we shouldn't put parents in that type of situation. Matt.
Are you prepared to acknowledge that parents who are better candidates, who have a better capacity to look after children, miss out on the opportunity to care for these children under your proposal?
Well, we say, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that there are lots of people in secular institutions who don't get adopted, ladies and gentlemen, is an argument that we should match those good gay parents to the parents in those institutions where children aren't being adopted, ladies and gentlemen. We say you can make that match, ladies and gentlemen, and you haven't given us any analysis on why you can't. But let's look at why we think it sets back the homosexual, the gay rights movement, ladies and gentlemen. Because we say, when you move forward with rights, so we say progressive rights is a good thing, we support civil unions, we support not allowing to gay bash in the workplace, we support not being able to incite racial hatred. Those are not zero-sum issues, ladies and gentlemen. You're not attacking and appointing some other group's rights, ladies and gentlemen. That's why we say most people in society were happy with that. But bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, they ran this hearts and minds case of people who are homophobic in society. We're saying in reality, this probably applies to people who have certain religious grievances against gay people, ladies and gentlemen. General society, we would argue, are moving towards a more tolerable situation for gay rights, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at gay culture in mainstream society, it's on the rise. If you look at people supporting gay marriage, people loved it when Elton John got married to that bloke, I can't remember his name. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much important. We say, if we show that gay parents can be good parents, or we think you can through secular organisations, we say that will also change as well. So this wholly simplistic argument that in order to change the whole gay rights movement, people's attitude to them, you need to take a specific policy is quite simplistic, ladies and gentlemen. But we say what's going to happen amongst the groups who you want to convince. Catholics, for example. We say you get sermons directed more and more against homosexuals attacking them, ladies and gentlemen. You get churches every Sunday preaching, you get Baptist churches, ladies and gentlemen, preaching against the evilness of homosexuality and why we need to take back the world, ladies and gentlemen. And we say that's damaging. That's instant trying to attack another group's rights is damaging, ladies and gentlemen, amongst the people you want to convince. And we say that's damaging. But also, ladies and gentlemen, you create this perception of victimhood. Because I don't like this argument that goes, in order to get equal rights, you need to be exactly like heterosexual people in every single last way, ladies and gentlemen. This sort of first stage feminist argument, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if that was first stage or second stage. I missed that part, but some stage argument that you need to be exactly the same as heterosexual people. We say no, ladies and gentlemen. It's damaging if you create that perception of victimhood. That's why Stonewall in the UK had this eternal bitter division and internal debates, because they realised actually in some circumstances can be bad for the gay movement. So don't let them portray this debate as being one group against another. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no clear sides in this debate. No, thank you. But I want to look at this argument, ladies and gentlemen, about why you damage children in one particular type of way. Because we say Catholics, ladies and gentlemen, have this doctrine of not aborting children. It's a very strong Catholic belief, ladies and gentlemen. And often, in many circumstances, you have people who conceive a child, who have a child, and because they haven't adopted, have to deal with the fact that they have a child in their hands. And we say often what they do is go to Catholic adoption agencies. But because we came to the analysis, ladies and gentlemen, that a lot of them were shut down, what we often do is put parents in a situation where they have to raise these children. They have to go through the process of not being able to give them to an adoption agency which is secular, or a Catholic adoption agency which can't refuse homosexual people. Because they might believe their child, their creation, might be placed in the hands of homosexuals. Now, even though I disagree with that, ladies and gentlemen, the very fact that parents will keep them to their children, even though they're not in a financial situation to look after them, even if they're not in a mental situation to look after them, leads to neglect, ladies and gentlemen, and that's deadly. We don't want a situation where parents are forced to raise people because they have rational fear that they might be raised by gay people. And we say ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, that's damaging for children. So yes, this debate probably is about social harm. We said a lot on our side that we've given you which they haven't engaged with. We've told you, ladies and gentlemen, it's damaging to the movement as a whole. It's damaging because it closes down a vital social service, and it creates resentment, ladies and gentlemen, and bad parenting. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, we don't believe this motion should pass. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and call for the member of government.
We'll finally, Madam Chair, a debate about my people. We're going to show at closing government, ladies and gentlemen, the practical harm of the model of the opposition on children in particular, especially accepting the opening opposition's lines that these charities are predominantly religious, and on that basis an accidental position of children under the purview of a religious organisation. My second point will be, how do you change what the benefit of our model is on religious organisations? How do you change the Catholic Church, ladies and gentlemen, if you just let them continue a policy of bigotry? But before I do that, I've got 3 points. Firstly, the argument there's another option. Secondly, the role of religious organisations. And finally, the argument about the homosexual movement. Firstly, whether there's another option. What we've heard from the opposition is there's another option and that's okay. Well, we have 3 responses. The first one is, that's not a good enough reason to discriminate. We've done a pretty good job showing you at government that just because some other people don't discriminate against you doesn't mean that other people are allowed to discriminate against you. Secondly, we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, considering that these institutions often have a monopoly on adoption in Western liberal democracies, particularly in places like Australia, ladies and gentlemen, where they have a predominant use of adoption, we'd say on our side of the house, if they have that monopoly, it's not an ability for someone to make another choice. But thirdly, we'd say it's about the interests of the child. And we think if you put this in that spectrum, the best interest of the child is to find the best family for that child. We don't think you can do that by prioritising someone over the other. But then we heard on that side of the house, well, consistency isn't a good enough reason, ladies and gentlemen, because we have exceptions for lots of different things. We'd say, firstly, this exception creates a substantial harm on children and society. It expresses a harm on children by not giving them to the best parent. We think that is a harm. But the message you send to society and to children is that homosexuals are not good parents. That's what this government policy does, ladies and gentlemen. It says you're allowed to tell homosexuals that they can't be parents. Then we have the role of religious organisations, and we heard from their side that you're making a choice to condemn these people, ladies and gentlemen. And what they said effectively is that kids won't like being in these sorts of families because they're taught not to like them. Well, firstly, a lot of these people are kids are newborn children, so we don't think that is actually the case. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we think when kids have a choice between a foster home and a loving family, they're going to choose a loving family, ladies and gentlemen, and they haven't shown you otherwise. The third and final point about the homosexual movement. What we heard firstly is you're going to create a backlash and people will be upset, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, we'd say there may be a backlash, but we'll show you why that's incredibly important to change religious institutions. But moreover, ladies and gentlemen, that's a policy to never do something like this. That's a policy to never allow homosexuals to adopt in the first place. And if we took that kind of line, ladies and gentlemen, Southern Methodists wouldn't be allowed, ladies and gentlemen, to continue their policies that they had in the 50s and 60s. And that policy was to not allow white kids to go into black families until the Civil Rights Act was passed. So we don't think that's a good enough reason. But finally, what we heard is that parents will raise their kids instead of putting them into adoption agencies because they're afraid that they'll go into gay families. Firstly, I think parents in the scenario when they're giving up their child just what the best interest for their child is.
Yeah,
we don't think you've shown any other reason. But secondly, they can often adopt within a family if they so choose, so you're still not stopping that. But thirdly and finally, ladies and gentlemen, we think that these people are in a desperate position and they will do what's best for their child, and we just don't buy and they're not going to give their kid away. Yeah.
Some people have a conception of what's in the best interest of the child, not based on what happens here on Earth, but based on what happens when, for example, their child might die in the future. Why isn't that analysis hard for people who are really Catholic and won't take abortions, for example?
Well, we accept that, ladies and gentlemen. We accept that that's going to happen in some of the cases. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, overall, the substantive benefit is far larger, ladies and gentlemen. And why do you give up your child if you're a Catholic family in particular, ladies and gentlemen? We think you give it up because you simply can't support them in the long term. We think, ladies and gentlemen, you give them up to give them a better chance at life. And we think that's the option they're going to make. I've got 2 points. Children and religion. So let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody admits that homosexuals can raise children very well, ladies and gentlemen, and no one is questioning that. But the context of this debate is that children are often in the care of religious adoption agencies by accident, and there are 3 reasons why. Firstly, because they fundamentally have a monopoly. They have the infrastructure, ladies and gentlemen, that already exists. And for that side of the house to say, well, gays can just go to a secular institution, how very nice, ladies and gentlemen. One for the homos and one for the straight people. We don't think that's the kind of message you should be sending, funnily enough. Lewis.
The point of the matter is, not everybody, including non-gay people, want to go to Catholic adoption agencies. There's a mismatch between lots of secular agencies who have a surplus of children back homes. Why don't you match that surplus?
So if there was a surplus, then homosexual people would go there. This debate occurs when there isn't a surplus of children. That's the whole point of the debate. Sit down. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, governments often give them to religious organisations because they're the ones who are often best equipped to do so. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, we'd say that just because kids are given up doesn't mean, by religious people, doesn't mean that they automatically hate homosexuals. There's a whole lot of Catholics, ladies and gentlemen, that I hang around with and love me, ladies and gentlemen, and we think they love homosexuals too. We'd say the consequence of this is that you allow agencies to have control, often over newborn children, without reflecting their religious beliefs. They just adopt or assume a religious belief for that child, ladies and gentlemen, without ever having an idea if that child was religious or not. The harm of that, ladies and gentlemen, is that the opposition policy effectively says that you can deny somebody's access to a child who doesn't necessarily have a religious affiliation on that basis. You could be the best candidate financially, you could be the best candidate socially, but because of your religious ability or your religious preference means that you can't get that child on a very arbitrary and quite frankly accidental opportunism, ladies and gentlemen. And that makes even worse when the government often funds these organisations which the opposition have neglectfully not mentioned. My second point is about religious organisations. And if you look at these religious organisations, firstly we'd say a lot of the flock don't necessarily follow what a lot of people at the top believe in, so that's your first problem. But secondly, a lot of these organisations won't change unless you force them to change, ladies and gentlemen. The only real change we've seen in the Vatican Church came from Vatican II, and that was changing sermons from Latin to English, whoop-de-doo. They didn't do very much else, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say you have to force them, ladies and gentlemen. You have to pry the door open with legislation. We've often done that. Things like hate speech, ladies and gentlemen, in my home state of Victoria is against religious organisations on that basis. We don't think exceptions are good enough in this debate if the harm is so incredible. We'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that gays should at the bare minimum have the option, the ability to have any child if they are in the best position to do so, and we don't think the fact that they're gay should stop them in any way whatsoever.
I can't dress myself, I promise you.
It's not well.
Madam Speaker, it's very telling that the last speaker from the last team set me the simple challenge to go, well, show me how these churches are going to change anyway. And we've got one really simple response. Not this way. This is just the wrong way completely to affect the kind of change that the opening government set their burden on. This idea of eradicating homophobia in a wider context. And lastly, the closing government have also pinned their hat on. Because what I want to do is I want to look at how actually is discrimination eliminated as a principle, and look at whether or not this particular manner is likely to eliminate the very problems that they have laid out. That's what I'm going to do firstly. Secondly, I want to look at the wider issue of religion in society, because we think this is going to have some very serious harms, even if we buy that their prop could work properly. And I'm going to go through this in a number of different ways. Because what we heard in opening half is kind of why this shouldn't happen. What I want to show you from closing off is why if this does happen, it will still have none of the effects that have been said in a more practical sense. So firstly, dealing with kind of the biggest challenge that's put down to me, how exactly is discrimination eliminated? And we think there are essentially two ways in which discrimination are eliminated. Firstly, by legislative force, and the secondly is by social shift. And we can look at like one very simple example of this. So where you have things that are simply negative, it's often a good case, for example, that you change it by legislative force. So for example, an employer who says, I'm simply going to sack people who are gay, is prevented from doing that, because he's prevented from just simply taking out that possibly negative linear action. If there's a wider perceptive issue, does legislative force do this? This is the second sort of thing. Does a perception where people perceive certain harms? And we say categorically no. Opening government hung their hat on this idea of Little Rock and busing, for example, the idea of busing black kids into white schools. But ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen, did this policy remove the kind of discrimination and separation and segregation in communities that we see? The answer is no. One of the reasons why Barack Obama is battling it out right now is he's saying, look, as a black man, I can see that the 1960s created huge casualties and a huge unintended knock-off side effects for this movement and these rights of my movement. We think that that is the absolute massive harm that you create in this. Because how does this harm work in practice? Because essentially you are forcing particular kinds of values onto people. And we say that this is none of the way that really works. The reason why there are now gay priests in the Church of England is not because Stonewall took the Church of England to court repeatedly and forced them to adopt gay priests about that, said that you're violating employment law, guys. And the reason why gay priests exist now in the Church of England is that the social shift has existed not only in wider society, but in the moderate religious movement as well. The ones that say, I might have a slight problem with this, but I can generally get on board with, for example, tolerating and taking homosexuals in that. You completely kill those people if you force it onto a social agenda. Those moderates are shut out completely from the debate. And we say that's a huge problem. We also say the next part of this is how will it actually help people, this sort of gays, the people who are in gay and homophobic communities themselves. And this is kind of like the Midwest farm argument. It's okay, so if you imagine, for example, you get little Johnny on the Midwest farm in America and he's being forced about coming out. We say it's going to get a damn sight harder for him to come out now after this policy. Because not only is homosexuality seen as an evil, something that's bad in generally, it's seen as something that enforces its views upon us. It is the metropolitan view being forced essentially upon us. That creates a kind of cultural dissonance that's almost impossible to surmount. The ones in the closet, as though we're still standing out for, as cruel as that expression may be, are massively harmed by this. Even if we allow, for example, casualties of a generation to take this way, we think there'll be numerous other spin-offs that will be affected by this, and numerous other harms that we can't even begin to predict in the university debate. I'll take a member from Open Gov.
Okay, you're saying that minority groups shouldn't seek their rights because they might be just pushing themselves on other people?
No. I'm not saying that at all, madam. I am saying that if they want to seek their rights and want the protections afforded, they have to choose an appropriate mechanism carefully. That's why I outlined two things, for example. I outlined how, for example, through a legislative force, it can work. In 1976, in my country, we passed a law preventing kind of discrimination in employment about black people. That doesn't mean necessarily that if you've completely eliminated other areas, which are much more softer, that come through just generally a long-term social shift. And this is one of them. If we want to get comfortable with the ideas of homosexual families and homosexual children being raised, It is not going to come through legislative force and alienating the majority of religious groups, and as well as that, allowing things pushing on society. Lastly, in all of this as well, let's just look at the second big point that I want to go through. So the even if example, because this was a lot of good, very positive benefits were elucidated by the member for closing government. And we think, as well as this, that the argument he said about how you feel that you have one for us and one for homos, and that kind of undermines all of opening oppositions, is just fundamentally flawed. What we think will happen is actually you'd get the idea of tokenism, firstly, all in all. That if religious charities were working for this, essentially when the gay couple does get that child, or is given that right to their child that they raise, it could be a something of tokenism. What's to stop religious charities simply doing the bare minimum they can not to fall foul of the law? And when they do this, are the kids really going to go, wow, I feel so wonderfully enfranchised now? No, they're going to feel like they're like part of a token. That's absolutely even more ridiculous. The second thing as well is that you're likely to get a massive proselytization about this being a negative cause. So you're likely to get all other religious groups that, for example, going, look at us, look how the state is cracking down on us. It's us versus the state, guys. Remember the good old days. This is exactly the kind of harm we create, where you lose the moderate movement. Also, as well as that, like a lot of the charities that exist in the United States, they're requiring big money from conservative Christians. They're likely to go under if the big conservative Christian donors say, well, I really don't want to be giving my money to promoting this kind of issue as well. We don't see in any way how this actually, for example, even if it was working perfectly, really actually helps the people that you're trying to help. The attitude, what we think, of a charity that's administering this towards those homosexual couples, where very often you need a lot of support to an adoption agency and a newly adopted child, is likely not to be that good if they know that they're doing this to enforce a social quota. I wouldn't like to be in the position of that gay couple having to go along to that particular Christian adoption agency and deal with their particularly homophobic attitudes that haven't gone away, but instead got more entrenched as a result of your policy. For those reasons, I beg to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for his remarks and call upon the government whip.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we just heard from the closing opposition is the concept, or their extension, that it's the gays versus religion. That there's just going to be this massive backlash when you force religious children upon homosexual couples, completely ignoring and failing to engage with our extension about the reality that these organisations play, about the monopoly that they hold over children, about the accidental nature often of these children. And they've also completely failed to consider what's in the best interests of the children at the end of the day. Because we think that's the number one priority when governments need to balance rights in this scenario. The message that the government is sending here is the message that you should be able to adopt from anyone, and that shouldn't be exclusive just because you weren't able to choose your sexuality, ladies and gentlemen. We think they've completely ignored the reality of the situation, the very real harms that come from these types of policies. Let's look at three things. Firstly, this concept of us versus the state. Secondly, this idea in terms of what's in the best interest of the children at the end of the day. And very finally, this idea in terms of the tension between religious freedom and homosexuality. So let's look at their extension about changing religion. Because what they firstly said is that we only use legislation for simple things, like you're not allowed to sack someone because you're gay. We'd say firstly, this is a pretty simple thing, that you have to consider people irrespective of their particular sexual desires, ladies and gentlemen. We think that by your own logic, it's a very simple and comparable thing here. We think secondly, we're not claiming that legislation in this scenario is a panacea. We've never asserted that this is the saving grace of the gay movement. What we did tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is a very real hurdle to types of developments we see. This is a very real hurdle to integration between religious people and homosexuals in today's debate. Because we'd say when you look at the example of a gay bishop, no thank you, a gay bishop in the Anglican Church, we'd say that they would have never been in a position to be able to put up a gay bishop if homosexuality was illegal in society, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say the existence and the very existence of being homosexual is offensive to all very religious people. That doesn't mean we make homosexuality illegal for them in today's scenario. But then let's look at this idea in terms of social change. Because we firstly told you in our extension, and this was ignored, that we don't see people like the Catholic Church changing of their own volition in any substantive way. For all their cry about us versus the state, they never showed how religious groups actually change their opinion unless they're forced to in today's scenario. We're proud to force them to do this and to leave them with no option. I'll get to the issue of whether they'll just shut down and pack up, because we don't think that's realistic. What we actually think you do to moderates in today's debate is you legitimise their cries in this scenario. You legitimise their claims that homosexuals have a role to play in religion. We think it's been a complete mischaracterisation of religions like Catholicism, that most Catholics don't like gays. We think that often the beliefs of the Vatican are a substantial difference to the majority of people on the ground. And when this debate takes place in the context of communities on the ground, we think that's a very damaging line to draw in this scenario. We heard this final concept that they'll just do the bare minimum, that they'll just let one gay or two gay in every couple of days. We'd firstly say, well, that's a hell of a lot more than they're letting in now. We think that's a really, really positive change in today's society, especially when the government's sending the message that you are a legitimate parent, irrespective of the perceived religion of that child. But more importantly, we'd say that they can't just do the minimum in today's debate, because as our opening team set up very clearly, the point is that you can't discriminate and effectively cut out a homosexual just because they're homosexual. We spoke to you in our extension about how it should be about considering what's in the best interest of the child, how it should be about considering the capacity of the parents in this scenario to look after them, a reality that they failed to consider. Go ahead.
You have just asserted through this debate that the state should play a role in constructing the identity of the Catholic movement. Tell us why that shouldn't be organic. You can't just assert that the state should
I'll tell you why it shouldn't be organic, because firstly, it doesn't happen organically, and you've never shown us how it does in a substantial way. We'd say secondly, the role that the state has to play in today's debate is through protecting children, ladies and gentlemen, through protecting the well-being of those children. That's why they should have a role in changing religion in today's debate, because their interests are paramount, especially when the government is giving money to these institutions only for them to systematically discriminate against homosexuals. No, thank you. Let's look at the second idea in regards to the best interests of the child. Because I asked very early on in a point of information that doesn't your policy of the status quo acknowledge that very capable parents that can deliver a better quality of life to these children are simply being ignored based upon their, no, you had your chance to engage, based upon their sexual orientation. What we'd say is in this scenario, they celebrated the idea that the secular people and the homosexuals have their one adoption agency, and that the religious people and the religious children have their own. Not only ignoring the monopoly concept, the fact that there aren't often secular institutions here. No, thank you. We think that you implicitly acknowledge, even though they haven't explicitly said, that these children are missing out on a better quality of life. We think it's fundamentally irresponsible for governments to be making this preference in today's debate, because when you look at the role and the intent of an adoption agency, its foremost preference, especially when government-backed, should be about the interests of the child. We don't think it's acceptable that the opposition doesn't consider that. Then we've had this idea that these children will just grow up and have an identity crisis. Ignore the fact that most adopted children are newborns and don't have that type of preconditioned belief. But irrespective of that, we'd say that you've never ever shown that everyone that ends up in a religious organisation is automatically religious. That's something you guys have asserted in today's debate. And because it's not uniformity, ladies and gentlemen, because they're not all Catholics in Catholic institutions like in countries like Australia, then the default position of the state should be to preference maximum liberty, should be to preference the maximum ability for a child to get a good life, and the maximum ability for a homosexual to be able to adopt out in this scenario. We think that what's in the best interest of the child in a very practical sense is that they get the best parent. And the reality of the scenario, as we told you in our extension, is that that just doesn't happen at the moment, especially given the monopoly nature of the scenario. Let's very finally look at the role of religion and the tension with homosexuality. Because what we heard from opening up is that religion is core to their lives. Yeah, no shit, guys, it is for some religious people, but we'd say that firstly, that doesn't mean that all religious organisations should automatically get to dominate the nature and the religion of the children that exist within that. We'd say secondly, the government doesn't let personal religious preferences trump where there is a substantial practical harm that we've shown you at closing government to the child. We point to the example of immunisation where even though you might have an ethical or religious objection, you have to immunise your child. We've shown you very clearly throughout today's debate that when it comes to a balance of rights, you consider the preferences and the very practical harms that their policy delivers. We think in regards to the gay movement, ladies and gentlemen, what's best for the gay movement, as we've told you, is to send a message that you're a legitimate parent, irrespective of the particular desires of an arbitrary distributor of these children in today's debate. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I've organised my summation of today's debate around three key issues, and they've lined up quite nicely for this debate today. The first one is about rights. I'm going to show you what claims the government made about rights to support their proposition and how they abandoned those claims over the course of the debate. I'm then going to talk to you about the alleged benefits of this proposition and why the opposition bench has done a strong job of undermining any potential benefits. And then I'm going to talk to you about the enormous harms that the opposition has established will result from this proposition. And I'm going to show you how those harms, most significantly, and the ones expressed by Fred most egregiously, have not been addressed so far by the government bench. So first of all, let's look at this question of rights, because there has been a tension in the government bench between whether or not they were asserting that the status quo was a violation of some fundamental right to adopt children that is assigned to homosexual couples, or if this is something that on a benefit analysis, harm-benefit analysis, they wanted to justify, even though they acknowledge that right isn't absolute. Now, at several points throughout their speeches, they said, no, this right does need to be absolute. And at one point, they hung their hat on the idea of consistency and said this right has to be consistent, even if there is a meaningful secular option for most gay couples. That means their right to adopt a child is actually actualized if they want to use it. That right does exist in a meaningful way for them. That is not enough. It must be the case that in every single instance of an institution that offers children for adoption, no thank you, those institutions are opening the door to homosexuals. And we responded to that argument on the opposition bench. My colleagues on the first opposition team said, well, wait a minute, that's inconsistent with the fact that there are loads of cases where we make exceptions. We don't pursue consistency for its own sake. So they said, well, no. It's offensive, it's a violation of basic rights, blah, 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 blah. But in a point of information, Fred gave them a very, very difficult example. He gave them the example of gays being allowed or women, being allowed to be ministers or priests or imams under individual faiths. And he said, wait a minute, isn't that exception rather analogous? And what did we hear then? This is very significant ideologically. Practically, it's a minor example, but ideologically, they said, well, no. Your right to employment is simply right to employment, not to a specific job at a specific time. Explain to me why your right to adopt a child applies to a specific child at a specific time. That's the question that we were asking, and that's the question that we didn't get a response to. Go ahead.
Sir, if we acknowledge we have a right to adopt a child, or you have a right to raise a child, it is not okay for anyone to violate that right.
Well, what we're saying is that doesn't mean you have to qualify for every single child that is on display in every single adoption. I mean, that's the difference. We asked you to justify that leap, and you weren't able to. Now, the second thing they did is, they also introduced this other, this notion of rights. They inverted it and said the child has a right to a home. This was introduced in the very last speech, no thank you, by my colleague before me. And we said, look, even if that was true, even if every child had the right to the broadest possible field, as long as there are still unadopted children in secular charities, like the first opposition team told you, that right is not being denied to any individual child. If it was the case that there were none of those children, and that it was a huge amount of children who were being denied access to a huge pool of donors, then that would exist, but that is not the stage to play in most liberal democracies, and that's why, if they want to resurrect that point, they've got to deal with what my colleagues on the opening op said about it. The second thing I want to talk about is these benefits, and they said, well, it'll make the next generation very tolerant, and we said that is a big, bold prediction, and we don't think it's a prediction that holds any water. What Fred told you in his speech is that discrimination, no thank you, is sometimes sometimes eliminated by legislative intervention, usually when there was a specific negative occurring, no thank you, in specific instances. But in this case, like we showed you, there are no parents here who do not have the option to adopt, and there are no children here who do not have potential parents. So where is the specific negative harm that gets erased by the legislation? No, we said that that isn't the type of change that we're dealing with here. We said that wider change happens when attitudes change. And this is where we got the biggest misrepresentation by the closing government team, who said, there is no progress on the gay rights agenda. The gay rights agenda is stuck in the mud. And we said, that's just not true. No, thank you. Look at the progress that the Church of England has made in terms of finally allowing gay ministers. That didn't happen in response to legislative intervention. Look at all the progress that has happened in terms of allowing adoption by gay couples in these liberal democracies. Look at the progress gay couples have made in terms of being able to marry, being able to be openly gay and brag about it and use it, employ it in a debate. Those are things that people weren't able to do a long time ago. Those are things that are changing every single day. We say this is a tolerable status quo. It's an evolving status quo, and it's one that we don't want to jeopardize with this risk of backlash. Now, the other thing they said in their assertion is that, oh, well, we'll have a practical difference where there's a monopoly. And we said, that's fine, but if you want to resurrect that point, which the speaker just before me attempted to do, he tried to resurrect this monopoly point, you've got to deal with the content of the opening opposition, who said if your concern is really monopolies in individual circumstances, if your concern is really then you should be saying that the government should be investing in secular charities in these areas. That's exactly what he said. And thank you. They also missed the fact what Fred told you about closures, which is even if it wasn't the case that these agencies are going to close of their own ideological dislike for this policy being foisted upon them, even if that wasn't the case, which it is, as my opening team said, Fred said the money may move away because those conservative investors who are investing their money because they want to contribute to the growth of Christendom are going to put that money in proselytizing. Instead of getting homes, those kids are going to get Bibles. Is that progress? Is that progress in the areas where the only adoption agency operating, like they said, is this individual conservative one? If these areas of monopoly exist, then the risk of closure, no thank you, is the risk of closure of the only one in that area. And what they should be propping instead is a government alternative in those areas, or a nationwide government secular alternative. No thank you. The last thing I want to talk about is this question of harms. Because we said, A, there's a harm in violating people's religious rights anyway. That's the one that we said, with the examples of Sikhs and their turbans, and religious self-actualization is something that the state, broadly speaking, intends to allow for as many people as possible. We didn't get any persuasive reputation of why those religious rights weren't important, or why they were able to be discounted, so much quickly that they wanted us to be able to discount the gay rights that they asserted. No, thank you. Sorry, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
What sort of message does this send to homosexuals that they are not allowed to go to these institutions?
Let me tell you the message it sends to the individuals that I'm most concerned with, and that is the children in this question. The message that it sends to those children is the backlash that we talked about. First of all, the message it sends is that you are willing to risk those individual children who you have now exposed, given the fact that we said that on balance, even though some of them are very young, on balance, you are talking about children who are likely to have more conservative religious views because they are raised in a convent, and you are putting those children in a home that the government has said that they have to go there, and for those children who end up as the token child, the one or two that you hailed as progress, for those children you have done them a massive disservice, because you've now put them in a situation where their own ideology of what they were taught up to when they were 8 is at odds with the family that they live in. And we say on the basic principle of pursuing harmony within the family as the ultimate goal of making these placements successful, of making these families successful, you have harmed those children. And anyone who thinks that token 1 or 2 children is good enough and counts as progress because the token 1 allows you to fight your war against ideology has never been the token child. And if you have been the token child, you've realized there is no glamour in it, there is no glory in it, and it isn't going to make the world be convinced that discrimination doesn't exist, because your role as a token is to prove to the world that your parents are capable of parenting. We don't think that's a responsibility that you should be putting on children in these circumstances. So because of the harms that we've told you in terms of tokenism, in terms of the gay rights backlash, in terms of asking children to be the victims of this backlash, to help them undermine the benefits and the rights analysis, we on Middle Temple are proud to oppose this movement.